Hi viewers, this is a video comparing two excellent cameras. One is the Leica Q on the left and the other one is Sony RX1R on the right. Now there are a lot of similarities and differences and let's get to it. So first of all, similarities. Well, these are obviously full frame, single focal length and fixed lens cameras. That was quite a mouthful there, but there are not many of these around. RX1 really started it a few years back with the 35mm f2 Zeiss lens paired with a Sony full frame sensor that's borrowed from the A7 series, and it caused quite a stir, and it is really a great camera. The lens is superb and the sensor is as well. And recently it was succeeded by the RX1R Mark II, and that one you can see in a video I also have comparing the RX1R and the RX1R Mark II. Now, the Leica Q is similar in that respect, and that has a full frame sensor, not manufactured by Sony, and it has a Leica lens, which is 28mm f1.7. And if you look at the depth of field between the two, 35 f2, 28 f1.7, they're actually pretty much the same. So in terms of depth of field control, you got basically an equivalent tool here. In terms of the body, they all have the same shape, but the dimensions are very different. As you can see, the Leica Q is much larger than the Sony RX1R, and same thing from almost every angle. And the Leica Q right here, I don't have the hood attached, which is right here. The hood actually comes with the Leica Q, and the Sony hood does not. So there's one minor difference there. But in terms of image quality between the two lenses are nearly impeccable. I've taken many pictures wide open and stopped down, and from corner to the center, it's extremely sharp. Really, if it's choosing it between the lens, it's kind of a wash. They're very good, and it's very hard to beat in terms of this matching of the lens to the sensor. Now, before I forget, actually, and I'm going to go through all the other elements soon, but the menu system. This RX1R has a very confusing menu system compared to the Leica Q. Everything on the Leica Q is very simple. As you can see here, the play, delete, ISO, menu button, they're just 5 buttons and then a D-pad here. On the Sony RX1, there's a lot of buttons, and then you can reassign each of them to different functions, which is good, but it's confusing until you have set it up just the way you want it to. And in terms of the experience, I would say using the RX1 is like using a computer with very good optics. And using the Leica Q, it feels like you're just using very good optics. There's one less layer between you and the image, and things are just a lot simpler to use. For example, with the shutter dial you have here, whereas here you don't. And just the way things are laid out and at your fingertips and simplified, it feels like more of a photographic tool, whereas the RX1R feels more like a very, I guess, sophisticated photographic tool that feels more like a computer in your hands. So anyway, getting back to the outer shell here. So in terms of handling, they're relatively similar. I'll give the edge to the Q because the body is thicker and it's more substantial, so it's easier to grip. There's also this indentation here for your thumb to rest, although I will say it's a little close to the edge here, so that doesn't really help too much. For the RX1R, it's really small and thin as well, so usually even though it's this small, you have to hold it with 2 hands just so you have some I guess grip on the body of the camera. So in terms of weight, the Q weighs about 700 grams and the RX1R weighs about 515 grams. So there's quite a bit of difference. It's almost 40% heavier than the RX1R. However, both are still pretty light compared to even other mirrorless offerings, such as the A7, especially once you add onto a lens. So in terms of other features, you have hard aperture rings here, so you can change the aperture without looking at the screen, and this is really nice for both cameras. The Leica takes it one step further, and you can make it go into automatic mode right here. And when you do that, depending on what the shutter dial is, you basically dictate which mode it is in terms of PAS or M. So if both are auto, then you have program. And if this is not auto and shutter is auto, then you have aperture priority. And if this is auto and shutter is not auto, then you have shutter priority. And if both are non-auto, then you have manual. So it's very intuitive. I believe Fuji also uses it on their cameras. It would have been nice for RX1 to do that as well, but as you can see, it's so small, it's no room for a shutter dial even. So another similarity is they both have 49mm threads. So in terms of the macro mode, they both have one, and it's actually very cool. On the Sony, you have this ring, and then you can rotate it, and you can see this element coming out when you do that, and then switch into macro mode. On the Leica Q, it's very similar, but they went one step further. It seems like Leica is trying to do that, just one step further than the RX1. When you do this, the actual distance ring also moves so that you have this reference. And where's the distance ring or the focal ring on the RX1? Well, it's not there because this is completely focused by wire, and it resets to infinity every time it goes back from standby, which is very annoying. On the Leica Q, I believe it's also focused by wire, but you have this ability to use this ring and manually focus with a reference, distance reference. So this is really cool. It's built for quick photography, street photography, so you can set it, you can do zone focusing very easily. You can go from off to on, and you'll be sure that this is the range you're getting based on your aperture. And that is a really neat, I guess, difference between the Q and the RX1. This is a lot better implementation. And once you go to the edge right here, it can snap into autofocus. So instead of this dial here, where you have AF and DMF and manual focus, you basically have that on this ring here on the Leica. So everything is just a little more well thought out on the Leica, a little more intuitive, and this is really nice. Now, one thing I should mention is when you go into macro mode for the Leica, it goes into f2.8 as the biggest aperture. On the RX1, it remains at f2. Alright, so now on the top, RX1 has a flash, or RX1R has a flash here, and that's actually pretty useful sometimes because the flash sync for these are really fast. This is 1/2000th of a second, and I think the Leica Q is 1/500th of a second, if I'm correct. So you can do flash photography outdoors and create some dramatic effects in photography. So you can do that with this, but not with that. Of course, you can do it if you attach an external flash, but you're not going to do that with the Leica Q, are you? So that's one advantage of the RX1R. The other thing is, this is kind of interesting. The RX1R has the exposure comp dial, whereas Leica Q has an unmarked dial. So I would have really liked to see a marked dial on the Leica Q so I can know just by a glance what setting I'm at, but apparently they didn't want to do that. So that's one thing also that's good with the RX1R. So then you have the on-off switch, and the on-off switch for Leica Q also goes into continuous shoot mode, whereas here there is no such thing, I believe, for the RX1R. On the Mark II there is. And there's a record button here, and the RX1R's record button is here. It's basically inaccessible. And the LCDs are similar sized, but the LCD on the Leica Q is a lot clearer, and I don't know why, because I think the resolutions are both around 1 megapixels, but on the Leica Q things just look clearer. So maybe it's a new generation of LCDs, maybe they don't do anti-aliasing before they display it on the screen. I don't know what it is, but it looks a lot clearer. And in terms of buttons, the Leica has a very clean layout. It has play, delete function, ISO and menu, and then you have a D-pad and a set. On here, there's no button on the left, but you have these auto exposure lock function. These four actually can be set to different custom functions. You have menu and delete. So it's pretty cramped here. You also have a dial for changing secondary functions, but it's very hard to use with one hand because when you're using it, you're basically covering all these buttons. And here you can actually use the other hand to operate. Now, a major difference is the inclusion of an EVF, the Leica Q. There is no EVF for the RX1R, but the second generation does have one. Now, this EVF has 3.68 million dots, if I'm correct. So that's quite a lot of dots, and usually it's around 2.4. So it's one of the highest resolution EVFs out there. And in terms of using it, the eye relief is not as good as I hope it would be, but it is definitely better than not having one completely on the RX1R. Although I have to mention again, the Mark II does have an EVF. So in terms of actually using it, what is the thing that you immediately realize with the two cameras? And that is the Leica is a lot more responsive, and everything you do in terms of including changing settings and changing the dials is immediate. And on the RX1R, it's just one step behind you. And this hasn't improved in the Mark II, as I've shown in my video. So to give you an idea of how responsive the Leica Q is, I'm just going to wake it from sleep right here by tapping this button. And you can see it's immediately on, whereas for the RX1R, there we go. And now finally everything is on the screen. And the other thing I'd like to do is just a quick autofocus test. I'm going to just shoot randomly around here, and when you hear the beep, that means the autofocus is found. I'm going to try to focus as often as I can. Yep, didn't focus. So you can hear this whirling, and that's because the whole element in the whole unit in the lens assembly actually moves. So it's quite a heavy unit to move during focusing, and that's why it is rather slow. Now for the Leica Q, which I'm sure has the Panasonic defocusing technology, it moves only one element as well. So both of them combined makes a very fast autofocusing experience. So here we go. So it's almost instant, and it's as fast as the fastest Micro Four Thirds camera out there, or even DSLRs, and it applies for both normal light and low light situations. The other neat thing about the Leica Q is it has a touch screen, and for most purposes it's actually not that useful, but for focusing it is really useful because you can tap on the screen and it'll focus and take a picture. So you can also choose to tap the screen just to focus and then press the shutter for focus for release. But this is really cool when the item or the subject you're trying to focus is off center. So say you're trying to focus a person's face here, you just press this and then it'll take a picture. How cool is that? So in this case it didn't quite focus because it's so close, but usually when you do that, it does work really well. And it also makes for some relatively discreet shooting because you can hold it below your eye and use your finger to touch and then release. And the sound it makes is very, very quiet, just like the RX1R. But this particular function of touch focusing and touch shooting is very, very useful that I wish the Sony cameras would have as well. So, all right, what other differences? Well, the color of the photos are slightly different in that the Leica Q has more of a saturated and contrasty look to it, whereas the RX1R files has a more muted look to them. But the RX1R file does have greater dynamic range by about a stop. So when you really pull shadows, the RX1R or the Sony sensor actually is better than the Leica Qs, even though the Sony sensor is about 2 years older, in this case the 24 megapixel compared to the Leica Q 24 megapixel sensor. And let's see, the battery life is actually another thing that's important. The RX1R, in my experience, usually lasts about 200 shots. So you carry around batteries with you almost every time because you know it's not going to last the entire photo trip. So this is the battery. It's rather small, and understandably the battery life is pretty dismal, and actually the new Mark II is even worse. Now the Leica Q, and let me just show you the battery, it's right here. It's beefy and actually the same as the Panasonic battery. So just by size alone, this camera usually has about twice the battery life of the RX1R in my experience. So about 300 to 400 shots on one charge versus about 150 to 200 shots on the RX1R. So that is another just convenience thing, that you don't have to worry about carrying 3 batteries. Here you just have to carry 1 spare, or if you don't take too many photos in a day, 1 battery should be able to do it. And let's see, another thing that apply to both is they're not weatherproof. So this is something I wish Leica and Sony have done to these cameras, because they're so expensive. You don't want to damage them out in the field, but neither of them is waterproof. Although I've not had problems in the past with a small bit of water, such as from light rain. And finally, one thing that the RX1R is convenient for is charging. So there is a battery door here that you can put in the USB cable and it will charge the battery inside the camera. This is really useful when traveling because you can connect it to a laptop or a wall USB charger and not worry about your charger. Now for the Leica Q, you cannot do that. It cannot charge in the camera, so you have to bring the actual battery charger with the cable, and that becomes a bit of a hassle when you're traveling. Another thing I should also mention is that the sensor performance. So both of these cameras, the reason why I'm comparing versus the Mark I here for RX1R is because both are 24 megapixels and they're both full frame sensors. They are, however, manufactured by different parties. This is Sony and this is, I think, CMOSIS, one of those firms. So from the ISO or high ISO noise perspective, when I look at the pictures, the Leica Q actually looks pretty on par with the RX1R's 24 megapixels, and the way they do noise reduction is a little different. Leica Q tends to preserve detail more than, I guess, aggressively reducing the noise, and Sony the other way around. So if you look at the pictures, more up to your personal taste of whether you want more details or more noise. So if you want more details, the Q is better. Although on the Sony you do have the option to turn off noise reduction or reduce it, or I guess set to low setting. On the Q you don't have the option. It's just locked in place. So in terms of dynamic range, like I said again, it's about 1 stop more on the RX1R. However, as you're aware, dynamic range decreases with higher ISO, and you could decrease the ISO required by using the optical image stabilization on the Leica Q. So it's pretty easy to gain a stop there by just using the optical stabilization. So I would say even the dynamic range for medium to low light situations, the Leica Q is actually better. So this is where you can't just rely on the lab test results, because those often quote the dynamic range at ISO 100, but usually that rarely happens unless you're doing outdoor photography. So in a way, the sensor is on par, if not better, than the RX1R, even though Sony has better intrinsic technology than the Leica Q. Okay, so finally, which camera to choose? Well, I think really the biggest factor here is the price, because if you don't consider the price, basically everything points towards the Leica Q for its faster response, its autofocus, its touchscreen, its let's see, the battery life, and the optical image stabilization. So everything plays in favor of the Leica Q except the price. As of this video, the Leica Q costs about 3 times as much as the RX1R. So are these things worth 3 times the price? Probably not. But if you look at also depreciation as a factor, if you're not planning to own this for 30 years, then it might make sense, because Sony products tend to depreciate a lot faster than Leica products. Although this is not a traditional Leica product because it's a fixed lens camera, so it's kind of unknown in that territory. But in a way, it really comes down to the price, how much you're willing to pay for those features that really enhance your photographic experience. So it's a trade-off on price, and if price is not a problem, then Leica Q 100%. All right, I hope this video has been helpful, and please subscribe. I'll see you next time.